History remembers the man who planted a cross on foreign soil, but not the woman who placed that cross in his hands. The year was somewhere near the close of the 15th century, when the known world ended at the horizon, and anything beyond was whispered about with awe or terror. Europe stood on a precipice driven by hunger and fear, gilded by faith and ambition. In Portugal, where the Atlantic wind rattled the tiled roofs of Lisbon and the river Tagus gleamed like a blade, the court of King Manuel Larner pulsed with dreams of empire. Men plotted courses into empty maps. They chased rumors of golden kingdoms and spice-laden shores. But no man could reach for the unknown without the invisible scaffolding of power holding him aloft. And Pedro Álvares Cabral, the man who would one day claim Brazil for Portugal, was not yet one of those men. He was born around 1467 or 1468 in the dusty hill country of Belmont, to a family of middling nobility, respectable enough to send sons to war, but far from the iron circles of power that wrapped themselves around the throne. He grew up in the shadow of greater names. The court considered him well-mannered, dignified, a fidalgo with a knight's training, and the bearing of someone destined for service, not command. He wore the Red Cross of the Order of Christ on his chest like so many of his peers, a symbol as much of ambition as of faith. But in the ruthless hierarchy of Manuel's Portugal, ambition without allies was like a ship without sails. Isabel de Castro entered his life like a prevailing wind. She was everything he was not, born to one of the oldest and most formidable families in the realm, descended from the royal house of Castile and the blood of King Fernando I of Portugal. Her surname carried the weight of centuries, her kin woven into the sinews of the realm's politics. Men at court lowered their voices when her uncles entered the halls. The Castro name opened doors that could otherwise stay locked for lifetimes. Yet Isabel was more than her lineage. She was sharp-eyed, deliberate, and accustomed to reading the silent movements of power as if they were music. Their marriage was arranged, as such unions were, but not cold. For Pedro, it was a sudden elevation, like a soldier knighted on the field. For Isabel, it was a gamble, to tether her name to a man of potential rather than pedigree. She saw in him something quiet and unyielding, the kind of resolve that does not crack when the winds rise. He saw in her not only beauty and refinement, but the steel lattice of influence he had never possessed. They were joined in the candlelit chambers of a Lisbon palace, the murmurs of courtiers curling like smoke from the walls. Outside, caravels swayed in the Tagus, their sails stitched with red crosses, waiting to be loosed into the abyss. The world around them was tilting. The Ottoman chokehold on Eastern trade had driven Europe to desperation. Gold from Africa trickled through Lisbon's docks, but spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, remained locked behind Islamic and Venetian monopolies. Then in 1497, Vasco da Gama returned from India, his hull stuffed with spices worth their weight in gold. Lisbon went mad with exultation. The king's dreams swelled like storm clouds. He envisioned a Portuguese dominion stretching from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, Christian banners planted on every shore between. To achieve that, he needed fleets, and to lead those fleets, he needed men not just of skill, but of unquestionable loyalty to the throne. Isabel sensed the current before Pedro did. She began to thread her influence quietly, weaving his name into the whispered short lists of the royal advisors. She drew on her uncle's patronage, reminded them of their duty to advance the family's fortunes. She curated Pedro's image as a man of discipline and moral steadiness, the kind of noble who would not enrich himself at the expense of the crown. She presented him at court banquets, not as an ambitious outsider, but as a loyal vessel of the king's will. He learned to hold his composure while rivals sneered, learned to carry himself like a man accustomed to command even before he had tasted it. At night, in their manor in Santarém, the tension pressed on them like the Atlantic wind pressing against a window pane. Isabel understood the stakes. If he failed to secure the king's favor, he would vanish into obscurity, and her own choice to wed him would be mocked as folly. If he succeeded, their children would inherit not only estates, but a place in the history of Christendom. She was willing to stake everything on that knife's edge. He began to feel the weight of that gamble like a stone on his chest. Then came the summons. In early 1500, King Manuel chose Pedro Álvares Cabral to command the Second Armada to India. 13 ships, over 1,000 men, in the hopes of an empire. The court gasped. The appointment seemed to materialize out of nowhere, bypassing older, salt-scarred captains. In the echoing halls of the Ribera Palace, as the king's herald announced the decree, some men masked their fury behind smiles, while others whispered that the Castro family had engineered it. They were not entirely wrong. Isabel stood in the shadows of the colonnade, her face serene, though her pulse raced like a war drum. It was the culmination of her quiet campaign, but also the beginning of their peril. For Cabral, the honor felt like an anchor wrapped in gold. He would have to guide 13 ships across seas no European had ever mapped with certainty, face rival empires, and return alive. For Isabel, it meant sending her husband into a void from which many never returned, staking her family's future on his survival. In the weeks that followed, Lisbon became a theater of preparation. Dockyards rang with the clatter of carpenters, barrels of water and salted meat rolled across the cobbles, cannon were hoisted aboard, charts unrolled like fragile prophecies, priests blessed the ships, sprinkling holy water on their prows. Sailors whispered about sea monsters and whirlpools and lands that burned like the sun. Cabral walked the decks of his flagship as if rehearsing for a role, while Isabel moved through the court like a shadow, silencing doubts, securing allies, ensuring that if he succeeded, no one could steal the glory from his name. On the morning of March 9, 1500, as the sun flared over the Tagus, the Armada slipped its moorings. 13 ships unfurled their sails, the red crosses blooming like wounds against the sky. Bells rang from church towers, crowds roared, and Cabral stood at the rail, his hand raised in salute, his jaw set like carved stone. On the quay, Isabel watched in silence, her fingers knotted in her cloak, the wind tugging her veil toward the sea. She did not wave. She did not cry. She only stared, as if memorizing the shape of him against the horizon, knowing that if he failed, the ocean would erase not only his name, but hers. The sails dwindled to specks, then vanished into the blaze of the Atlantic. In their wake, the harbor settled into stillness, and Lisbon turned back to its intrigues. Isabel remained on the stone quay long after the crowd dispersed, alone with the shriek of gulls and the echo of bells fading into the wind. She had placed the cross in his hands. Now the world would decide what he did with it. The days after the Armada's departure unfolded for Isabel like the dim echoes of a thunderclap, quiet on the surface, yet trembling underneath with the memory of something vast and violent. Lisbon moved on as it always did, its alleys full of fishmongers and spice whispers, its palaces humming with gossip. But she felt suspended outside of time. The palace where she had once glided with serene calculation now seemed cavernous and hollow, every jeweled archway an empty frame without Pedro beside her. She had spent years bending the court's attention toward him, molding him into the image of a man fit to carry the banner of Christendom across the edge of the world. And now, the moment he was gone, she felt the shape of his absence like a missing limb. Yet she had no luxury to grieve. The Armada was not just her husband's gamble, it was the cornerstone of the king's imperial dream. Portugal had cast its hopes like dice into the void. If Cabral succeeded, he would be celebrated as the man who cemented the empire after da Gama cracked it open. If he failed, he would be erased, buried under accusations and whispers until his name rotted at the edges of memory. And with his name, hers would vanish too. She understood that reputation in King Manuel's court was as fragile as gossamer. A single rumor could kill a man more efficiently than scurvy or cannon shot. Already, rival factions were watching her closely, their smiles edged with the hope of seeing her stumble. Vasco da Gama's allies, still flushed with the triumph of their hero, whispered that Pedro was untested, a noble pawn lifted by marriage rather than merit. Isabel's presence at court became an act of constant warfare, her face composed like polished marble, while she parried insinuations with grace so sharp it cut. She could not let the court see fear. Fear was blood in the water. Each day she performed the liturgy of influence. She attended Mass beside the Queen's ladies, murmuring prayers while gauging which of them tilted their heads when her name was spoken. She sent fine wine to the counselors who oversaw maritime funding, subtle reminders of her gratitude. She walked the palace gardens with her uncles from the Castro line, reinforcing their loyalty and quietly reminding them that Cabral's triumph would elevate their blood as much as hers. When she returned home at night, her composure would collapse like a breached hull, and she would sit by the window staring toward the Tagus, wondering which way the wind was carrying her husband. The waiting gnawed at her. Ships at sea vanished into silence. There were no dispatches, no maps of what lay between Lisbon and the Indies, only the vast indifference of the Atlantic. She tried to busy herself with estate matters, overseeing harvest accounts, arranging dowries for distant cousins, but each quill stroke felt brittle and hollow. She dreamed of him instead, of his hands gripping the rail, his eyes scanning horizons she could not see. She imagined him charting courses by the stars, the decks reeking of pitch and brine, the air alive with the creak of rigging and the mutter of prayers. She imagined the solitude wrapped around him like a second skin, a solitude she could never reach. Pedro carried her image with him as if it were a second compass. On the flagship's stern castle he paced at night. The Atlantic stretched like black glass beneath the moon, the constellations burning cold above. The men feared him a little already. He kept his face unreadable, his voice measured, his posture carved from duty. Yet beneath the armor of command, he was haunted by what it meant to hold the fate of an empire in his hands. He knew the king had gambled not just on his seamanship, but on the illusion of his invincibility. If the fleet splintered, if disease gutted the crews or storms swallowed the ships, it would not be Manuel's gamble that the world blamed. It would be Cabral's failure. And so the burden bore down on him like the weight of all Portugal. The sails strained under the trade winds as the Armada curved southwest, following the Volta do Mar, that strange arc across the open Atlantic no map dared to mark. It was a dance with forces larger than men could comprehend. Currents, pressure, the spin of the earth itself. And if his calculations faltered, if he misread the stars by even a whisper, they would vanish into the endless blue. For Isabel, those weeks stretched like a taut rope. Lisbon celebrated other things: births, festivals, the drip of gold from Africa. But she felt time halt. She moved through days with deliberate precision, arranging her face into serenity even as her thoughts frayed. She imagined the Armada shrinking as it sailed, the ships dwindling to specks and then to nothing, until only her faith tethered them to the world of the living. She could not admit aloud that she feared the ocean would swallow him before he ever saw India. Yet somewhere inside her, a fire refused to gut her out. She had watched men rise and fall at court, their names scoured away by failure, and she had decided long ago that Pedro would not be among them. If he lived, she would make the world remember him. If he died, she would make the world mourn him. She had wagered her lineage, her standing, and the legacy of her unborn children on his survival. It was not love alone that drove her. It was the certainty that greatness required someone willing to burn everything else for its sake. In the third week of April, a whisper began to stir in Lisbon's merchant taverns, a rumor of land. Sailors swore they had seen a flock of parrots brought ashore, their feathers like embers. Someone had heard from a courier that one of Cabral's ships had dispatched a small caravel back north, bearing news. No one knew what land they had found, or if it was merely an island. But the rumor slithered into the palace, and Isabel caught it like the faint scent of smoke on the wind. She said nothing. She smiled serenely when others mentioned it, and locked the spark behind her ribs. If it was true, if Pedro had stumbled upon a shore that no European had claimed, then the trajectory of the world had just shifted, and her husband's name would be soldered to it forever. She could feel the axis of history beginning to tilt beneath her feet, though the court did not yet see it. They still spoke of India, of spices and ports and profits, blind to the idea that the greatest thing he might bring home was not pepper or cinnamon, but the idea of a continent. Isabel rose early the next morning and walked alone to the monastery at Geronimos, where the stone arches dripped with dawnlight and the air smelled of salt from the nearby sea. She knelt on the cold floor before the altar, the hem of her gown pooling like ink. She did not pray for his safety. She had long since abandoned the notion that God bartered with mortal fear. She prayed only that if he stood upon new land, he would stand unshaken, and that the world would not dare to forget his name. She was still kneeling when the bells began to toll above her, their iron voices rolling out over Lisbon, mingling with the cries of gulls and the sigh of the tide. Somewhere far beyond that horizon, Pedro was sailing toward a line on no map, carrying not just the hopes of a kingdom, but the weight of her entire world on his back. The ocean does not announce revelation. It withholds, then yields all at once. After weeks of running with the trade winds, the Armada's curve across the blue emptiness met something that was not sky and not sea, but a darker line stitched along the horizon, a hush of green layered above a pale blaze of sand. The helmsman watched it sharpen, the pilots murmured measurements, and the decks leaned as men crowded the gunwales, breath held as if noise might frighten the vision away. Trees gathered themselves out of haze, a serrated crown of forest rising beyond an unbroken beach. The name came to them later, but the astonishment arrived first. Land where their charts showed none, familiar air braided with a fragrance not known in Lisbon. Wet leaf, resin, a sweetness like sap warming in the sun. They trimmed sail and eased toward the coast. Surf foamed in smooth, regular sets along a crescent of sand broad enough to swallow a parade ground. Inland, a low blue shape rose like a shoulder from the earth. A hill that would be called Monte Pascal because the feast of Easter was near, and the liturgical calendar was the language through which men explained the world. The sea turned glassy in the lee of a shoal, and the fleet hovered just beyond the break. 13 hulls rocking as if they too were in a kind of prayer. Cabral did not speak. Command lived now in his posture and his patience. He watched the color of water, felt the wind slacken, read the set of the tide. If the ocean is a scripture, he had learned to finger its margins. Anchors bit, cables sang, boats were lowered, and oars flashed like fish backs as the first landing party pulled for shore. The beach met them in a silence broken only by the flap of pennons and the round-bellied sigh of waves. Then the forest answered, a drift of voices from the tree line, the keen glance of figures emerging as if the earth itself had grown them. Bodies painted with ochre and charcoal, feathers bright as parrot wings, bows held loosely, not raised, curiosity before calculation. The Portuguese were a festival of iron beside them, breastplates, morions, pikes, metal catching the sun as if it were not an element but a conviction. Between these two ways of being, a breeze moved. The men on the sand gestured with open hands pointing to themselves, to the ships, to the sky. The ones from the forest answered with the same grammar, laughter sounding sudden and bright, the air between them filling with a precarious ease. Gifts were produced, trinkets, cloth, little bells that sang when shaken. The strangers touched them, turned them in their hands, glanced again at the ships anchored like floating hills. On a later morning, they would plant a cross of timber on a rise of land and say Mass facing the sea. The friars' vestments would lift in the onshore wind, incense would coil upward, and the unfamiliar forest would listen as the old Latin rolled over it, words sent like an arrow toward a heaven that lay equally distant over all men. Cabral stood at the edge of that ritual with the stillness of someone holding two minds at once. The private awe of standing on a shore no map admitted existed, and the trained conviction that sovereignty must be spoken aloud to become real. He named the place Ilha de Vera Cruz, Island of the True Cross, a pious imprecision produced by caution and perspective. Only later would they admit it was not an island at all, but a continent's soft shoulder leaning into the Atlantic. The name would be revised like all first names are, Terra de Santa Cruz, then, under the pressure of commerce, Brazil, after the dyewood gleaming red in a merchant's imagination. What the eye records as miracle, the ledger translates into opportunity. The sailors dragged timber from the edge of the jungle and found it sound. They tasted fresh water in creeks ribboning through the sand. Parrots flashed in flocks like fragments of flame, and monkeys watched from the canopy with the grave concentration of judges. Men walked a little way inland and returned glazed with sweat. speaking of soil that would grow anything you asked of it if you only learned its grammar. The pilots took bearings. The scribes noted depth and shoal and vantage, each mark a stitch in the crown's claim. Above them, frigate birds wrote their idle glyphs against a clean sky. Somewhere in that lull between astonishment and procedure, Cabral's thoughts turned toward Lisbon with a force that almost unsteadied him. Discovery is not a private practice. If it is to alter the world, it must be witnessed, recorded, dispatched. In the flagship's great cabin, by lamplight made unsteady by the harbor's pulse, a clerk sharpened a quill and unfolded thick paper. Pedro Álvares de Cabral's hand moved with the composure of a man conscious that his sentences would become the scaffolding on which understanding would be built. He described the land as generous, the people as without guile, the trees as splendid and strange, the shoreline as a promise laid open. He wrote for a monarch who needed a reason to believe that God's providence had tilted a piece of the earth into the Portuguese half of the world. The letter became a map made of words, its paragraphs beaches, its adjectives forests. A small vessel was chosen for the run back north. Its hull was provisioned as if feeding a pilgrim. Pilots took star altitudes and committed them to memory. The messenger carried not just ink and paper, but the first thread joining this shore to Europe's loom. They set the boat on its course and watched it lean into the swells and diminish until it became a thought rather than a shape. With it went the first version of the story, curated and controlled, a narrative of abundance and grace and legitimacy, but also of calculation. The line drawn by the Treaty of Tordesillas cutting the ocean like a blade. In this land, by God's exquisite geometry, falling on their side of it. The law of empire did not require only cannon, it required documents. On the beach, the mast gave form to that claim. The friar lifted the host and the sun made a white square on it as if endorsing the moment. Men knelt in armor that warmed under the equatorial light. Those who watched from the forest edge tilted their heads, puzzled and serene, as the sea breathed in and out, equal and indifferent. Faith's words unfurled and folded again. A cross stood where there had only been sand and wind before, planting meaning like a seed that would root in soil that did not ask for it. For Cabral, the elation was laced with the first taste of responsibility's iron. Naming is a burden. To fix a cross in the sand is to bind yourself to what it implies. Return, governance, conversion, defense. His mind, part navigator, part courtier, kept a ledger of next steps even while his eyes drank the saturated green of a world unscarred by European hunger. He thought of currents that would carry them onward, of the arc they must carve to find again the old coordinates around Africa, of the men's strength after the long crossing, of hulls that needed caulking, of the wind's small betrayals. He thought of the palace's cool rooms and Isabel's careful stillness in them, the steadying gravity of her presence, the patient web she had woven that made it possible for him to be here at all. In Lisbon, the rumor of land hardened into the weight of a letter. It entered the city like a pilgrimage object, borne by sunburned hands, and traveled through corridors that smelled of beeswax and breath, to rooms where maps lay open like wounded birds. Ministers bent their heads. The king's eyes brightened with a light that mixed piety with calculation. The news reached the cloisters and the taverns at the same speed, and Lisbon's talk shifted key. Not only India, not only spices, a shore in the west that could be claimed by law as much as by sale. Merchants saw the future in the color of wood shavings. Priests saw it in souls. Men of the sword saw it in lines of coastline that could harbor fleets. Isabel encountered the truth as she had encountered every danger and every chance since the day she fastened her life to Pedro's. Without ceremony, the message was placed into her hands, the seal broken before she saw it. The script of Camina observed with the hunger of someone measuring a fate in each phrase. The letter's tone was serene. Its news was not. The world had just leaned toward her family's name, and she felt the tilt like a change in weather on the skin. Joy did not arrive as ecstasy. It came as a series of exhalations she had not realized she was holding, and as a new tension braided through the old. Glory was a threshold, and thresholds demand payment. She understood the arithmetic. Claiming a shore summons rivals. A cross on a beach is a beginning of obligations. The ocean that had given this gift could take everything else with the same implacable hand. She closed her eyes and saw Pedro not as the court would see him, planted like a statue beside a timber cross, but as he was when he left her, alert, inward, braced against a wind nobody else felt. She could almost smell the resin and the hot iron of the ship's fittings, hear the gulls, see the shadow of his profile cut against a light that might be dawn or might be fire. On that beach, the Armada restored its strength. Casks were filled, repairs made, muscles fed on the gentler food of a gentler shore. The forest watched with the soft persistence of leaves moving. The encounters remained tentative, brokered by gestures and smiles, threaded by an innocence as fragile as spun sugar. No one yet spoke the words plague or slave or conquest aloud. All first meetings have a light that time will later dim. The men went barefoot in the surf and laughed like boys. Parrots shouted in the canopy as if commenting on human plans. The friar folded his vestments carefully after Mass and dried the salt from the silver. Calculation roused itself and took command again. The fleet weighed anchor on a morning that looked like another version of paradise, and the ships leaned eastward to rejoin the old route. The pilot's mind set on soundings and headlands they already knew. The land they left behind seemed to hover above the water like a green mirage, then flattened into a smear, then withdrew into the same long blue anonymity that had once concealed it. Cabral stayed at the rail until the last of the tree line blurred into sky. Discovery is not possessing, it is promising to return. He felt that vow lay across his shoulders as tangibly as any cloak. The men turned their faces toward the Cape of Good Hope, as if toward an exam. Beyond that corner of the world waited everything that Europe had taught them to crave and fear. Markets, rivalries, the negotiation of profit and pride, cities where faith and calculation mixed like spice in air. He counted the ships, watched the weather, listened to the murmurs of crews who had just been presented with a miracle and would now be asked to pay the bill of being mortal again. In his cabin, charts lay pinned with pebbles against the draft. Camina's copies dried. The cross on the beach, timber and symbol, stood behind them now like a witness. Lisbon would soon fasten this shore to a date, and then to a policy, and then to a series of ships that would return again and again, until return itself felt like a right. Isabel would step more lightly through the palace, not because the work had lessened, but because the horizon had suddenly become wider than her critics' imagination. The same mouths that doubted would now practice praise, and she would accept it without mistaking it for protection. She had learned to love in a world where love could be amputated by a squall. She had learned to build reputation in a place where reputation could be dissolved by a whisper. The new land offered no cure for those realities. It offered only a stage larger than the old one, upon which all the familiar dramas could be played again at a scale no one yet understood. When the wind freshened and the Atlantic shouldered the hulls toward the south, Cabral felt the fleet begin to gather speed. The rigging tightened into song. Behind them, on a shore that had only just been given a European name, a cross stood in sunlight, its shadow short and unwavering. Ahead, the ocean had already chosen a different vocabulary. Cloud ranks, a lowering swell, a taste of iron in the air. The men at the pumps worked without being told. The helmsman felt the wheel grow heavy. The Cape would test them like an examiner who enjoys the work. The green shore sank into memory, and the unknown resumed its familiar size. He did not look back again. He did not need to. A letter was already on the way, and with it the part of the story that empires believe first, the version that favors purpose over accident and providence over weather. The rest, the cost, the contradictions, the shadows that follow any cross planted on foreign ground, would come later, and he would meet them where the two oceans argue their case against each other in wind and in waves. The Armada bore down into the vast curve, and the horizon resumed its old reticence, as if it had never spoken at all. The sea that had carried them gently from Lisbon, that had curled back like a compliant page to reveal the shore of Brazil, began now to show its truer face. South of the equator, the sky shed its softness. The light sharpened until it seemed to hum against the hulls. The air grew heavier and restless. Beneath the keels, the ocean deepened in color from azure to something colder, almost black, as though the ships were gliding over an inkwell with no bottom. The helmsman muttered about the way the wind shifted, not in sharp gusts, but in slow, sly pulses, like something alive considering its prey. Cabral stood at the rail and felt the change coil around him. They were leaving the cradle and approaching the trial. The Cape of Good Hope lay ahead like an exam written by God and corrected by death. Every sailor in Portugal knew its reputation, a hinge of the world where two oceans collided like beasts, where storms were born from clear sky, where currents tore masts out of hulls as if plucking weeds. Bartolomeo Diaz, who had rounded it years before and lived, paced the deck of his ship with a composure that seemed carved from resignation. Even he knew that survival here was not proof of skill, but merely a reprieve granted once. The Armada pressed south, the wind sharpening behind them, the swell steepening until the ships rose and plunged like slow clock hands. Rigging shrieked, masts bowed, sails bellied and snapped. The horizon flattened into a wall of vapor the color of forged iron. The first squall hit at dusk, a wet hammer that erased the line between sea and air. Rain fell so thick it seemed to close over their heads like a roof. Lightning stitched the sky, each flash carving the silhouettes of men clinging to rigging like insects. The sea lifted and broke in ridges that crashed across decks, sweeping casks, men and prayers alike into the dark. Cabral moved like a ghost of intention from ship to ship, signaling by lantern, shouting through a voice tube until his throat shredded. The Armada fractured into blurred lights veering through white spray. He could not tell where the ships ended and the storm began. Sound itself became indistinct. Canvas tearing, timbers shuddering, men screaming, the thunder cracking open the air like stone splitting. The storm was not a thing they fought, but a world they were dragged into, a world without direction or mercy. At the height of it, when night and ocean had swallowed the stars and the fleet was scattered like dice thrown into surf, Bartolomeo Diaz's ship vanished. One moment its lantern winked through the rain like a defiant pulse. The next it was gone, snuffed clean. No wreckage, no cry, only an absence so abrupt it seemed intentional. Cabral felt it before he knew it, a hollowness in the pattern of lights, as if part of the constellation had gone dark. Diaz, the man who had first proved the Cape could be passed, had now been claimed by the same waters he once defied. They clawed southward for days that stretched like a single unwaking hour. Salt burned in every wound. Men tied themselves to the mast to keep from being washed away. The storm did not rage so much as persist, like something offended. Cabral drove himself past exhaustion into a kind of crystalline clarity, his mind a strip of cold metal. He counted the ships whenever a break in the cloud revealed them, each count like the tolling of a bell for those missing. He measured their survival in heartbeats and hope, and yet, fragile as breath, they endured. One dawn the storm slackened as abruptly as it had risen. The wind fell. The waves eased, shedding their iron color for green. Sails were rehoisted in silence, their tatters snapping like wounded birds. The survivors looked at one another as if surprised to still possess faces. They gathered the dead into canvas, weighted with stone, slid them overboard into the slow heave of the sea. Each splash erased a name. Cabral stood alone on the forecastle and let the sun dry the salt crusting his skin. Grief sat on him, not as a blow, but as ballast. 4 ships were gone, including Diaz's, hundreds of lives erased as if they had never stood on the decks at all. And yet the fleet sailed still, a remnant clawed from the maw of the ocean, still aimed toward India. That contradiction lodged itself in him like a thorn. The world celebrated triumph, but was built on disappearance. Far away in Lisbon, Isabel felt the storm without knowing its shape. She had no report, no messenger, only the sudden cold in her chest when the wind off the Tagus shifted and the bells at Geronimo's tolled low in a windless dawn. She moved through the palace as if balanced on a precipice only she could see. Rumors began to curdle in the air, sailors' widows praying for men not yet declared lost, whispers that the sea had taken the fleet whole. She walked the corridors with her spine like drawn steel, never allowing her breath to catch. Fear could not be shown. Fear made predators of courtiers. Each night she knelt at the stone sill of their manor in Santarem and stared into the dark. She imagined Pedro standing at the prow, lashed by rain, face raw with salt, and she anchored herself to that image as if it were the only real thing left in the world. The court thought of voyages as lines on maps. She knew they were threads spun over abysses, and every thread frayed. If he drowned, they would call him reckless. If he lived, they would call him destined. Either way, she would be made to account for him. Cabral did not write about the storm in detail when they reached calmer water. He buried it as sailors do, under the routines of survival. But something had shifted behind his eyes. He had crossed not only a geographical boundary, but an invisible threshold between mortality and obligation. He understood now that command meant carrying ghosts as cargo, that every league won from the sea had to be paid for in names that would not be carved on any monument. The burden settled on him like an extra layer of bone. The cape loomed ahead, a bruised shadow on the rim of the world. They would round it if the wind allowed. The survivors lashed their gear, tightened the lines, whispered to the saints. Cabral walked the deck with a calm that had calcified over terror. The men saw only composure, not the fissures beneath it. This was how legends were made, not in conquest but in endurance, in the refusal to sink when everything reasonable said to drown. Behind them the graves of their comrades drifted in the cold upwellings, nameless, weightless, absorbed into the same element that bore the survivors onward. Ahead lay India and profit and further tests of blood. Cabral felt the fleet lean as the wind rose again, carrying them toward the next theater of expectation. The storm was over, but its silence clung to him, a hollow space where other men had stood. He would fill it with purpose, or it would crush him. And in Lisbon, Isabel woke from an unremembered dream, breath sharp, fingers clenched in the linen. Dawn washed the tiles in pale fire. Somewhere beyond her reach, her husband had survived, or he had not. Either way, the world would decide what his name meant. She rose and dressed in silence, a queen without a crown, and went to the palace to ensure that if he lived, the throne would still have room for him. The sea that had carried them gently from Lisbon, that had curled back like a compliant page to reveal the shore of Brazil, began now to show its truer face. South of the equator, the sky shed its softness. The light sharpened until it seemed to hum against the hulls. The air grew heavier and restless. Beneath the keels, the ocean deepened in color from azure to something colder, almost black, as though the ships were gliding over an inkwell with no bottom. The helmsman muttered about the way the wind shifted, not in sharp gusts but in slow, sly pulses, like something alive considering its prey. Cabral stood at the rail and felt the change coil around him. They were leaving the cradle and approaching the trial. The Cape of Good Hope lay ahead, like an exam written by God and corrected by death. Every sailor in Portugal knew its reputation, a hinge of the world where two oceans collided like beasts, where storms were born from clear sky, where currents tore masts out of hulls as if plucking weeds. Bartolomeo Diaz, who had rounded it years before and lived, paced the deck of his ship with a composure that seemed carved from resignation. Even he knew that survival here was not proof of skill, but merely a reprieve granted once. The Armada pressed south, the wind sharpening behind them, the swell steepening until the ships rose and plunged like slow clock hands. Rigging shrieked, masts bowed, sails bellied and snapped. The horizon flattened into a wall of vapor, the color of forged iron. The first squall hit at dusk, a wet hammer that erased the line between sea and air. Rain fell so thick it seemed to close over their heads like a roof. Lightning stitched the sky, each flash carving the silhouettes of men clinging to rigging like insects. The sea lifted in broken ridges that crashed across decks, sweeping casks, men, and prayers alike into the dark. Cabral moved like a ghost of intention from ship to ship, signaling by lantern, shouting through a voice tube until his throat shredded. The Armada fractured into blurred lights, veering through white spray. He could not tell where the ships ended and the storm began. Sound itself became indistinct, canvas tearing, timbers shuddering, men screaming, the thunder cracking open the air like stones splitting. The storm was not a thing they fought, but a world they were dragged into, a world without direction or mercy. At the height of it, when night and ocean had swallowed the stars, and the fleet was scattered like dice thrown into surf, Bartolomeo Diaz's ship vanished. One moment its lantern winked through the rain like a defiant pulse. The next it was gone, snuffed clean. No wreckage, no cry. Only an absence so abrupt it seemed intentional. Cabral felt it before he knew it. A hollowness in the pattern of lights, as if part of the constellation had gone dark. Diaz, the man who had first proved the Cape could be passed, had now been claimed by the same waters he once defied. They clawed southward for days that stretched like a single unwaking hour. Salt burned in every wound. Men tied themselves to the masts to keep from being washed away. The storm did not rage so much as persist, like something offended. Cabral drove himself past exhaustion into a kind of crystalline clarity, his mind a strip of cold metal. He counted the ships whenever a break in the cloud revealed them. Each count like the tolling of a bell for those missing. He measured their survival in heartbeats and hope. And yet, fragile as breath, they endured. One dawn the storm slackened as abruptly as it had risen. The wind fell, the waves eased, shedding their iron color for green. Sails were rehoisted in silence, their tatters snapping like wounded birds. The survivors looked at one another as if surprised to still possess faces. They gathered the dead into canvas, weighted with stone, slid them overboard into the slow heave of the sea. Each splash erased a name. Cabral stood alone on the forecastle and let the sun dry the salt crusting his skin. Grief sat on him, not as a blow, but as ballast. 4 ships were gone, including Diaz's. Hundreds of lives erased as if they had never stood on the decks at all. And yet the fleet sailed still, a remnant clawed from the maw of the ocean, still aimed toward India. That contradiction lodged itself in him like a thorn. The world celebrated triumph, but was built on disappearance. Far away in Lisbon, Isabel felt the storm without knowing its shape. She had no report, no messenger, only the sudden cold in her chest when the wind off the Tagus shifted and the bells at Geronimo's tolled low in a windless dawn. She moved through the palace as if balanced on a precipice only she could see. Rumors began to curdle in the air, sailors' widows praying for men not yet declared lost, whispers that the sea had taken the fleet whole. She walked the corridors with her spine like drawn steel, never allowing her breath to catch. Fear could not be shown. Fear made predators of courtiers. Each night she knelt at the stone sill of their manor in Santarém and stared into the dark. She imagined Pedro standing at the prow, lashed by rain, face raw with salt, and she anchored herself to that image as if it were the only real thing left in the world. The court thought of voyages as lines on maps. She knew they were threads spun over abysses and every thread frayed. If he drowned, they would call him reckless. If he lived, they would call him destined. Either way, she would be made to account for him. Cabral did not write about the storm in detail when they reached calmer water. He buried it as sailors do, under the routines of survival. But something had shifted behind his eyes. He had crossed not only a geographical boundary, but an invisible threshold between mortality and obligation. He understood now that command meant carrying ghosts as cargo, that every league won from the sea had to be paid for in names that would not be carved on any monument. The burden settled on him like an extra layer of bone. The Cape loomed ahead, a bruised shadow on the rim of the world. They would round it, if the wind allowed. The survivors lashed their gear, tightened the lines, whispered to the saints. Cabral walked the deck with a calm that had calcified over terror. The men saw only composure, not the fissures beneath it. This was how legends were made, not in conquest but in endurance, in the refusal to sink when everything reasonable said to drown. Behind them, the graves of their comrades drifted in the cold upwellings, nameless, weightless, absorbed into the same element that bore the survivors onward. Ahead lay India and profit and further tests of blood. Cabral felt the fleet lean as the wind rose again, carrying them toward the next theater of expectation. The storm was over, but its silence clung to him, a hollow space where other men had stood. He would fill it with purpose, or it would crush him. And in Lisbon, Isabel woke from an unremembered dream. breath sharp, fingers clenched in the linen. Dawn washed the tiles in pale fire. Somewhere beyond her reach, her husband had survived or he had not. Either way, the world would decide what his name meant. She rose and dressed in silence, a queen without a crown, and went to the palace to ensure that if he lived, the throne would still have room for him. The sea calmed as if ashamed of what it had done. After the cape, the water smoothed into wide plains of green and gold light. The air ripened with warmth, and the constellations tilted into unfamiliar arrangements overhead. The fleet limped north along the edge of Africa, hulls scarred, sails patched like beggars' cloaks, crews thinner and quieter than they had been when they left Brazil behind them. The losses gnawed at Cabral in private, though his face betrayed nothing. Every man still breathing looked to him as proof that their ordeal had purpose, and he wore that illusion like armor. Even grief had to wait until the mission was complete. When the wind swung east and the Arabian Sea opened like a gate, the smell changed. It arrived on the breeze before the land appeared, spice and smoke, resin and unfamiliar flowers, a sweetness sharpened by heat. The pilots adjusted their headings by sun and current, and gradually the coast of India rose from the haze, a smear of ochre and green, then the hard verticals of palm trunks, then the layered sprawl of rooftops at Calicut. The city shimmered under the sun like something woven from copper and mirage. Here Vasco da Gama had come 3 years before, stunned the world by reaching India, and opened Portugal's hunger wide. Cabral knew the court expected not just repetition, but escalation. He had to return not with news of feasibility, but with proof of dominion. The holds of his ships were meant to drip with pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, the aromatic currencies that Europe would treat like gold dust. Calicut was the key to that fortune, the busiest port on the Malabar coast, a hive where merchants from Arabia, Persia, Africa, and India converged in tides of language and color. At first, the reception was velvet. The Zamorin, ruler of Calicut, sent emissaries hung with silk and sandalwood garlands to escort the Portuguese ashore. Cabral and his captains walked in a procession through alleys rank with spices, their boots clicking over ancient stones worn by centuries of caravans. Markets spilled on either side like ruptured chests. Pyramids of peppercorns black as night, cinnamon curled like lacquered tongues. Bales of cotton dyed the color of bruised fruit. The air pulsed with drums, with the calls of merchants hawking wealth by the handful. They were shown the trading quarter offered to them, a compound near the docks. Timber was stacked, warehouses raised, the Portuguese flag climbed a mast. It looked like the seed of empire taking root. At night from the decks, Cabral watched the glow of Calicut's lanterns ripple on the harbor and told himself this was what the king had sent him for, to translate discovery into possession. But beneath the silk, resistance stirred. Muslim merchants from the Red Sea, who had dominated this trade for generations, saw the Portuguese as wolves in their pasture. They whispered to the Zamorin's courtiers, sowing suspicion. They warned that the newcomers came not to trade, but to conquer, that behind their polite treaties waited cannon and fire. The Portuguese spoke of partnership. Their rivals spoke of plague. Tension braided through the harbor like an undertow. Brawls flared in the markets, prices warped. The warehouses filled with pepper, slowly, grudgingly, as if the city were testing them. Cabral sensed the ground under his feet softening. He tightened patrols, kept his men close, stored powder near the guns. The Portuguese could trade like merchants, but they thought like soldiers. Then the rope snapped. One evening, a mob surged the Portuguese factory, blades drawn, torches spitting. The garrison was small, unready, the air filled with screams and iron and burning cloth. Men who had survived the Cape were butchered among their spice sacks. Smoke climbed in slow ribbons over the rooftops while the tide hissed against the pilings below. By dawn, dozens of Cabral's men were dead, their blood drying black on the warehouse stones. The survivors staggered back to the ships hollow-eyed, faces scorched with disbelief. Something in Cabral set like cooling metal. Well, he had lost 4 ships to the sea and endured. He had found a continent by accident and treated it with awe. But this was not accident, not storm, not fate. This was defiance, and defiance demanded answer. He called a council on the flagship's quarterdeck. The sun struck the iron of the cannon as he spoke. His voice was low, clipped, stripped of ornament. The Portuguese had offered friendship. The Zamorin had promised protection. They had been answered with slaughter. There could be no commerce without consequence. The Armada moved at dawn. They rowed boats ashore with slow, surgical purpose, anchored them broadside to the docks, ran the guns out, and opened the bellies of their ships. The air shattered. Iron shrieked over water and burst through timber and flesh. The waterfront erupted in splinters and screams. The Portuguese methodically raked the quays, the warehouses, the alleys nearest the port. Flames took hold of the timbered roofs and leapt skyward. Smoke rolled over the market quarter in veils, smothering the scent of spices with the stench of char. The sea itself seemed to recoil, waves slapping back from the heat. From the quarterdeck, Cabral watched the bombardment unfold with the stillness of a man watching a bridge burn behind him. The men cheered between broadsides, their terror transmuted into exultation by the rhythm of recoil and flame. But Cabral's mouth stayed a hard line. He saw not vengeance, but necessity, not triumph, but transaction. Terror as currency, to buy the space Portugal needed to trade. Each explosion was another name gone, another alley erased from the map, another thread cut from the city's tapestry. When the smoke thinned, the waterfront was a blackened ribcage. The Armada withdrew slowly, sails slashed with soot. The harbor's waters were littered with the wreckage of boats and bodies. Calicut smoldered behind them like a wound that would not close. On the voyage south to Cochin, the deck smelled of scorched rope and spent powder. The men were drunk on survival, faces flushed, voices loud in the nights, as if trying to drown the echo of what they had done. Cabral kept apart, writing brief, sterile entries in the log. He did not write about the bodies. He did not write about how the flames had reached for the sky like something pleading. He knew the court in Lisbon would not want those details. They would want pepper, cinnamon, proof of victory. They would call it retaliation, not massacre. But the truth nested in him like a live coal. He had crossed a line that had no return. He was no longer the man who planted a cross on a distant beach, who marveled at parrots and monkeys, who walked among new forests with reverence. He had become the instrument of Portugal's will, and instruments are not permitted wonder. He understood that his name, if it endured, would endure not as a man, but as a blade. Far across the world, Isabel felt the shift without knowing its shape. Weeks later, the news would reach Lisbon, first in whispers from merchant agents, then in the polished phrasing of royal dispatches. They would say Cabral had avenged his dead, that he had taught the East to respect the Portuguese flag. The court would murmur approval, the king's eyes would shine with the cold light of strategy, and Isabel would smile like stone. In private, she would read between the lines, see the soot hiding under the praise, and wonder what the sea had carved out of the man she had sent into it. She had placed the cross in his hands. Now he had struck with it, and the ocean, vast and impassive, bore him onward as if nothing had happened at all. The coastline unspooled southward from the smoldering memory of Calicut, green and gold under a pitiless sun, each headland sliding into view like another chance or another test. The air smelled of damp earth and clove smoke. The men stood quieter now at their stations, laughter gone brittle in their throats, as if they feared their own voices might summon judgment. Behind them, the city burned still in imagination, a black tooth lodged in the bright jaw of the Malabar coast. Cabral stood at the rail and watched the horizon as if it were a tribunal. He had struck and lived, but he carried the echo of what he had done like ballast. He did not name it guilt. Guilt implied choice. In his mind, Calicut had forced his hand, and the Portuguese hand could never be seen to tremble. Yet he knew something had cracked. The dream of arriving as traders under the sign of the cross lay buried under the char and rubble. They were no longer guests here. They were predators, and the sea itself seemed to know it. The water had turned darker, the wind cooler, the gulls circling lower as if the fleet now carried a scent that drew scavengers. In the great cabin of the flagship, Cabral drew a map on the table with the point of a dagger. Calicut was finished for now. Its merchants would not risk them again. But further down the coast lay Cochin, a smaller kingdom constantly bruised by its rivalry with the Zamorin. If Portugal could not anchor its future in power, it would anchor it in division. The logic was as old as empire. Make allies where you cannot make subjects. The approach to Cochin was like stepping from shadow into a mirror of possibility. Palm forests feathered the sky. The harbor cradled the ships like a hand. The Raja of Cochin received them on a pavilion, bright with vermilion banners, gold bangles climbing his arms to the elbow. His eyes were sharp, and behind his careful welcome, Cabral saw calculation flicker like a blade. Cochin feared Calicut and needed a protector. Cabral feared isolation and needed a foothold. Between their needs, an alliance took shape like a bridge rising from both banks of a river. They traded gifts. Cabral offered scarlet cloaks, mirrors, brass cannon polished until they threw sunlight like fire. The Raja offered warehouses, pilots, and pepper still warm from the drying racks. Portuguese carpenters set to work shoring up the quay. Scribes copied contracts in curling Latin and Malayalam, sealing them with wax the color of dried blood. By night, the air filled again with the dense perfume of pepper and cinnamon, but this time it smelled less like wealth than like reprieve. Cabral moved through these days with a deliberate stillness that concealed the fissures in him. The men saw only command restored, their captain reborn from fire. They did not see how often he stood alone at the bow, staring into the dark like someone listening for a voice no longer speaking. He could not shake the image of his men butchered in Calicut, nor the way their deaths had turned him from explorer into executioner. Wonder had been scoured out of him like rust from a blade. What remained was function. He had learned the grammar of empire, and it spoke in canon. In Lisbon, the news traveled by fractured rumor, salt-stained and delayed, reshaped by every mouth it passed. Isabel heard of Calicut as one hears of storms. First the distant muttering, then the confirmation too late to help. Courtiers whispered that her husband had avenged Portuguese honor. Some whispered other words: massacre, brutality, fire. She listened without flinching. Her face remained the polished serenity she had worn since the day he left. But inside her, something tightened like a fist. She had defended his name for years, tended it like a fragile lamp through the winds of gossip, and now she felt that light guttering under the smoke of what he had become. Yet she did not falter. If the court smelled weakness, they would strip her family's future bare. She leaned on her uncles of the Castro line, reminding them that the Armada was still afloat, that no one else had yet bent India to their will, that glory was never clean. In salons, she praised the courage of men who faced the East's perfidy. In private, she knelt before the altar in their manor chapel and wondered if she was praying for the same man who had once left her. Letters crossed the ocean like thin veins of hope. They arrived in Lisbon, warped by humidity, ink blurred by salt. Pedro's script was spare, clipped, like a man conserving breath. He wrote of warehouses filled, of alliances sealed, of new friends in Cochin who welcomed the Portuguese flag. He did not mention the fire, or the screams, or the blackened timbers that still haunted his nights. Isabel read between the lines anyway. She could feel the hollowness in the words, the way his hand had pressed the quill too hard. The Armada grew rich again, holds filled with pepper, cinnamon, ginger, indigo. Cabral shifted the fleet to Cananor, where another petty king bowed low to receive him. Here, too, he planted Portugal's seed in fertile soil of fear, promising protection in exchange for allegiance. The captains strutted on the docks, weighing the cost of victory in coin instead of blood now. They had forgotten Calicut. Cabral had not. He knew their survival had been purchased by terror, and terror must be renewed or it withers. Yet sometimes alone he wondered if something irretrievable had slipped from his grasp the moment the first cannon fired at Calicut. He had once imagined himself as the vanguard of knowledge, bringing back new worlds in the palms of his hands. Now he felt more like a tide dragging splinters behind it. The voyage had become heavier than he was. Each crate of pepper was a stone on his chest. Each mile home would be measured in ghosts. Still he pressed on, because to stop was to be erased. The sea does not keep space for the hesitant. He drove the men like clockwork, tightening discipline, counting barrels, testing lines. He would deliver the wealth Manuel demanded, even if he returned hollow. He would not let them say he had failed. In Lisbon, Isabel's poise began to harden into something colder. She visited the court less often now, letting absence sharpen curiosity about her rather than gossip corrode her. When she did appear, she wore the black velvet of mourning cut in the shape of triumph, her hair wound in braids like a coronet. The ladies whispered that she had the look of someone who had seen her name already carved in stone. In truth, she felt as if she were watching her life from the far side of a glass ocean, her future suspended on the survival of a man who no longer fully belonged to her. At Cochin, the warehouses brimmed, the contracts sealed, and the ships crouched in the harbor like great beasts laden with treasure. The first monsoon clouds were building in the east, tall as mountains, their bellies bruised purple. Cabral stared at them and thought of Lisbon, of stone streets and river fog, and Isabel's steady eyes. He would return to her changed beyond recognition. He suspected she would know it before he spoke a word. He had crossed the world and planted Portugal's emblem on foreign shores. He had bartered lives for wealth and wrapped alliances in the scent of blood. Now he would turn his back on the Indies and carry his spoils home, like a pilgrim bearing relics that burned his hands. The ocean waited, flat and inscrutable, ready to decide whether his name would return with him or sink beyond the reach of memory. They turned their prows west when the sky was still bruised from the dying monsoon, the air slick with the smell of wet stone and clove smoke. The warehouses of Cochin stood behind them like husks, emptied of their treasure, the quays deserted save for gulls. The fleet slipped from the harbor on a wind that rose pale and steady, their masts black against the swollen dawn. They had loaded the world's worth of wealth, holds swollen with pepper, cinnamon, ginger, cardamom, each spice a seed of gold. But the ships rode low not only from cargo, they rode low from the weight of what they carried that could not be counted. The sea received them in silence. Currents drew long, slow ribbons under their keels, the swells lifting them like the breath of something vast and weary. They had been gone more than a year. Time had become elastic, slipping around them like water. The men moved through their routines like survivors of a siege, precise, exhausted, superstitiously careful, as if sudden joy might provoke the ocean into snatching them away. Cabral walked among them without speaking, eyes on the horizon, jaw locked, his presence the thread holding their fragile cohesion together. Each day stretched thin and translucent. The ships left trails of foam that unraveled behind them like the fading lines of old plans. Cabral kept the fleet close as they rounded the cape again, his gaze raking the horizon for the ghosts of storms. They threaded the same waters that had eaten 4 of their ships on the way out. The sea was merciful this time, almost reverent, the swell long and even, as if the ocean itself remembered the cost and held its hand. Yet even in the calm, he could not escape the shadows. They followed him like ballast. When he closed his eyes, he saw the warehouses of Calicut collapsing in fire, the surf boiling with bodies, the pale mouths of drowned men yawning open under green water. He saw Bartolomeo Diaz's lantern blink out into blackness, the empty space where it had been glowing like a wound. He had buried them all in silence because the mission demanded it, but the dead had not agreed to stay buried. They rose in his thoughts like wreckage surfacing. At night on the stern castle, he stood under the spray of stars and felt their presence around him. They were what the world would never know. The men who had kept the mast standing, the ropes coiled, the compasses dry, and had vanished between one heartbeat and the next. They were as essential to his arrival in Lisbon as the pepper sealed in the hold, yet they would return as weight only, not as names. He wondered if their absence would cling to him like the scent of tar, if Isabel would smell it on his clothes and not know what it was. As the latitude numbers on the astrolabes crept higher, a tension grew in the fleet, not fear now, but a kind of fever. Survival had sharpened into greed. The captains prowled their decks, calculating their share, dreaming of palaces, vineyards, thrones of silver coins. They spoke in low, urgent tones about who would present which chest to the king, which noble houses might offer their daughters in exchange for new fortunes. Cabral watched them with an expression that gave nothing. He knew wealth would not save him. Lisbon did not forgive men. It consumed them. He replayed the return of Vasco da Gama, hailed as the hero of an age, then quietly set aside, his victory eaten hollow by courtiers who feared his pride. Glory in Portugal was not a laurel, it was a noose lined with silk. Cabral's own appointment had been born from the politics that had undermined da Gama. He knew those same knives were waiting for him too, honed by envy and the need to rearrange the hierarchy once again. When the Azores rose from the mist, the crews howled like wolves. The Atlantic rolled out beneath them, blue and immense, the smell of Europe's forests trembling faint on the wind. Gulls appeared, pale and reckless, swooping around the masts as if escorting them home. Men wept openly, their faces cracked by salt and sun. They began scrubbing the decks obsessively, polishing brass until their reflections stared back, as if trying to erase every trace of what they had seen in order to be fit for Lisbon's gaze. Cabral did not weep. He felt only the ache of tension unwinding and leaving something hollow. He thought of Isabel, of how the court would have worn her down in his absence, how she would have stood still as a statue while they circled her. He imagined her walking through the palace with her eyes steady as drawn blades, defending his name like a fortress of silk and will. The thought both steadied him and filled him with dread. He had left her as a man with wonder in his hands. He was returning with blood on them. They sailed up the Tagus in midsummer, the river's mouth glittering like a sheet of hammered gold. Church bells pealed as the fleet appeared on the horizon, the city's roofs rising red and white from the green hills, banners unfurling on the towers. Crowds lined the quay, their cries echoing off the stone like surf. The Armada crept upriver, heavy with treasure, sails slack with exhaustion, every line of the ship sagging from the long pull of gravity. On the quay, Isabel stood in the front rank of nobles, her face calm as the saints carved into the monastery doors. She had dressed like victory, black velvet braided with gold thread, her hair coiled high, a necklace of jet and pearl clasping her throat. She did not wave. She did not smile. She only watched as the ship slid into the harbor, her gaze fixed on the man at the prow of the flagship as though nothing else existed. When Cabral disembarked, the crowd roared like surf breaking. Courtiers pressed forward, voices bright with congratulation, hands grasping at his cloak, his sleeves as if some of his fortune might rub off. The air stank of sweat and rosewater. The king's heralds read proclamations naming him a hero of the realm. He bowed, accepted the praise with the composure of marble. Inside he felt nothing. Their eyes met across the crush. For an instant the noise flattened, the world narrowed to a single, silent axis. Isabel's gaze did not flicker. Cabral walked toward her through the tide of hands, and when he reached her, she laid her palm on his cheek like someone touching the surface of a mirror. He saw the recognition in her eyes, and the shock, like someone staring at a portrait that has changed while they weren't looking. That night, after the formalities were spent and the crowds had spilled back into the crooked streets, they returned to their house in Santarém. The hall smelled of cedar and candle wax, exactly as they had when he left, as if the world had not shifted under them. They stood together in the courtyard under the orange trees. She touched the gold thread on his sleeve, and he thought of the men who had died for it. She said nothing. He said nothing. They did not embrace. They only stood in the scented dark, two survivors of different wars, measuring the distance between who they had been and who they were now. Lisbon slept in a dream of wealth. In the palace, King Manuel paced over maps lit with lamp glow, already planning the next fleet, already sharpening the next ambition. Cabral sat motionless in the silence of their courtyard, unable to feel triumph. He had brought home everything the world desired, spices, gold, the proof of Portugal's dominion, but he felt hollow as if the sea had scraped him clean and left only the shape of obligation. And Isabel watched him with eyes that saw further than the maps. She knew Lisbon would not let him rest. She knew they had not returned with riches, but with ghosts. Lisbon celebrated him as if he had returned with the sun itself folded into his sails. Processions thundered through the streets. The bells of Geronimo swung until the air trembled, and poets praised his name in lines bright as gilt. The city reeked of pepper, cinnamon, and wealth. Yet beneath the gilded noise, The machinery of envy had already begun to turn. Portugal's glory was a feast that consumed its own servants, and Cabral, despite his triumph, had walked back into the jaws of it. At first, the dissonance came as whispers, light as dust. The court praised his courage but muttered about the 4 ships lost off the Cape. They admired his discipline, yet hinted at recklessness. They accepted the treasure he brought home as if it were their birthright, then questioned the blood that clung invisibly to it. Letters from Calicut had arrived through rival hands, retelling the massacre as barbarity, exaggerating the fire, the bodies, the screams. Portuguese merchants, who had not risked the sea but longed for its profit, warned that Cabral had poisoned trade with violence and fear. He sat through the royal reception like a statue draped in laurel, his face unreadable. King Manuel embraced him before the court, kissed him on both cheeks, proclaimed him the crown's faithful servant, and in the same breath began speaking of the next fleet, the greater fleet, the true conquest of the Indies. The words were knives wrapped in silk. Cabral heard what the others missed. He had delivered the key, and now they would hand it to another. The confirmation came quietly, weeks later, as if it were a minor matter. The king summoned him not to the grand audience chamber, but to a narrow council room smelling of ink and damp stone. There, with the curtains drawn against the river's glitter, Manuel informed him that Vasco da Gama would command the next armada to India. The words landed like cold iron. Cabral had carried the banner across half the world, planted it in fire and blood, and now the court would erase his footprints to make way for the hero they preferred. He did not argue. He bowed as ritual demanded. He left the council chamber with his steps measured and silent, the corridors yawning around him like the ribs of a carcass. Outside, Lisbon roared with commerce, ships groaning at the quays, carts spilling pepper across the cobbles, and not one voice called his name. The court had already begun to forget him. Isabel saw it unfolding with the precision of someone who had learned to read the air for the smell of betrayal. The same nobles who had courted her during his voyage now passed her in the palace halls with their eyes sliding away, as if her presence embarrassed them. Da Gama's partisans filled the salons, their laughter sharp as spurs. They spoke of strategy, of discipline, of the king's new vision for the Indies, and never once spoke her husband's name. She did not plead, did not protest. She knew the game too well. Power did not answer to justice. It answered only to momentum. Once it turned from a man, nothing could turn it back. Instead, she began to withdraw her claws from the palace's velvet. She stopped attending the banquets. She sent polite regrets to the queen's invitations. She let the city wonder if grief or pride kept her away. And by wondering, they left her dignity intact. In their manor at Santarem, the air was different. The rooms echoed now. The servants moved softly, as if in the presence of something fragile. Cabral spent his days in the cedar library where dust drifted like sleep. He read none of the chronicles that now omitted his name. He stared instead at the blank vellum of unused logbooks, pages that might have borne new oceans if he had been allowed. The hands that had gripped the wheel at the edge of the world now lay still on the table like artifacts. He was not yet old, but defeat ages men differently than years. The vitality that had once hummed through him seemed to leach away, replaced by a hollow quiet. He spoke little. He walked the orange grove behind the house in slow measured arcs, as if charting a coastline invisible to others. He no longer visited Lisbon. He had learned how easily the city erases its heroes, how quickly triumph curdles into inconvenience. Isabel became the fortress that held their legacy upright. She managed the estates with surgical precision, arranged alliances for their children, and reminded the Castro uncles in pointed letters that her husband's blood had purchased Portugal's foothold in the Indies. She built a shield of property and pedigree around their name so that history's tide would not wash it away entirely. And when she passed him in the hall, she touched his arm in silence, as if to anchor him to the world. He felt the gesture but could not return it. The part of him that had once strained toward the horizon had gone slack. He understood now that empire does not reward service, it devours it. He had been the blade Portugal flung into the dark, and now that he was dulled, they had cast him aside. He was not the first. He would not be the last. Years thinned around them like worn silk. The great fleets came and went, da Gama triumphant and then spent, other captains rising, planting crosses on shores Cabral had never seen. Maps blossomed with new coasts like bruises blooming. Brazil, which he had touched as if in a dream, became a steady trickle of pau-Brazil logs and rumors of sugar and gold. His name appeared sometimes in the footnotes of other men's glory, a shadow without substance. At night he lay awake in the cedar darkness, listening to the wind comb the eaves, and thought of the beach at Porto Seguro, of the green canopy trembling in the sun. He wondered if the cross still stood. He wondered if the forest had swallowed it whole. And Isabel, watching him fade by degrees, understood what the court never would, that the sea had not defeated him, nor had Calicut or the storms. It was Portugal that had broken him, the very crown he had bled to serve. So she drew the curtains, locked the gates, and turned their house into a sanctuary where the world could not find him. The empire had taken what it wanted. She would keep what was left. The seasons in Santarém passed like the slow turning of pages in a book no one read anymore. The river below their hill glimmered through cycles of silver and mud. Summer's blaze fading into autumn's pallor. The orange grove whispering in winds that no longer carried the sound of sails. The world beyond their walls moved on without them. Lisbon roared with caravels and treaties. Brazil's name hardened on maps. And new fleets lashed the oceans into ribbons of foam. But in the Cabral household, time dulled to a muted rhythm, like the pulse of a man who has been bled too often. Pedro Álvares Cabral aged in silence. Not the violent collapse of a body ravaged by disease or shipwreck, but the quiet corrosion of someone whom the world had chosen to forget while he was still alive. His once erect frame stooped as if under invisible rigging. His steps slowed to a drag through the gravel paths of the garden. The fire that had once driven him to hurl himself across oceans guttered low, feeding now on the thin fuel of habit. He rose with the dawn, though he no longer needed to, walked the orchard as if patrolling the ghost of a coastline, returned to the cedar library, and sat for hours unmoving, his gaze on nothing, as though listening to a sea no one else could hear. He rarely spoke. When he did, his words came measured and disjointed, like soundings taken in uncertain water. The servants learned to step softly around him, their eyes sliding away. The world's roar, which had once bent to his will, now seemed distant as thunder over another continent. Isabel did not allow the silence to consume them. She moved through the house like a fixed star, holding its order intact. She saw to the tenants on their lands, settled disputes between farmers, negotiated dowries for their daughters, secured positions at court for their sons. The house never slipped into disrepair. The silver gleamed, the linens were folded tight as sailcloth, the candles replenished. She would not let neglect tarnish what the crown's betrayal could not erase. To the neighbors they appeared as a household merely retired from the noise of empire, not exiled by it. In the evenings she read aloud from chronicles of the great voyages, her voice even and clear, though she could feel his mind receding while she spoke. The names of new captains drifted through the air like the calls of distant birds. Francisco de Almeida, Afonso de Albuquerque, men carving their legends in the same waters that had once nearly taken his life. Cabral sat in the shadows and listened without blinking. His name did not appear in those books. It was as if the world had decided that his cross on the beach, his year of storms and fire, had been an error politely erased. Sometimes at night, when the lamps were out, Isabel would wake to find him standing barefoot in the courtyard, staring at the stars with the intensity of a man trying to summon a vanished root from memory. She would call his name softly, and he would start as if pulled from underwater. Then he would return to bed and lie stiff on the mattress, hands folded on his chest like a carved effigy, eyes wide in the dark. What he could not say, what he perhaps could not even name to himself, was the hollow left by meaning gone slack. For years the world had pressed against him like a relentless tide, demanding proof of his will. He had given it everything, the lives of his men, the bones of his courage, the marrow of his youth. He had flung himself past the map's edge and come back dragging a continent behind him like a captured leviathan. And now it had all dissolved into a footnote, a mist over the river. He no longer knew what the years had been for. Isabel knew. She understood with the clarity of someone who had built her life on the edge of power that history is not the sum of deeds, but of who controls their telling. The king had chosen da Gama as the architect of Portugal's myth. The chronicles would exalt him and those who followed, and Cabral would be left in the margins, a shadow best forgotten because he reminded the empire of its debt. She could not change that, but she could keep the man alive inside the ruin. She began writing letters under his name, polite, dignified missives to old allies, thanking them for their loyalty, reminding them gently of her husband's role in the Indies' conquest. She wove his memory into the living fabric of their children's futures, securing for them positions in the king's guard, in distant fortresses, in the order of Christ. She understood that while the world might erase Cabral the captain, it would not erase the bloodline he had given her. The world had taken his glory. She would make sure it did not take his name. Cabral watched her do this with the distant wonder of a man watching a ship launch from a harbor he no longer believed in. Sometimes, briefly, gratitude flickered across his face like sun through broken cloud. More often, he simply nodded and returned to his chair in the orchard, his eyes on the river's slow coils below the hill. The years narrowed, his body thinned like rope fraying from within. The garden filled with silences that seemed older than either of them. Lisbon kept expanding outward. Brazil's forests fell to axes. The Indies became a lattice of fortresses and spice routes, and all of it passed them by as if they were already ghosts. And yet in that hush, Isabel found a strange, defiant peace. She had spent her youth carving space for him in the roaring furnace of empire. Now in the long dusk of their lives, she carved silence around him like a sanctuary. She would not let the world see the hollow it had made in him. To visitors, she presented them as serene, content, their withdrawal a choice rather than an exile. On certain afternoons when the wind came from the west, carrying the faint tang of salt up the Tagus, Cabral would straighten for a moment in his chair, eyes glimmering with something that might have been memory or longing. Isabel would sit beside him, her hand resting lightly over his, and they would watch the light move across the river like the wake of an invisible ship. In those moments, he seemed almost returned to her, not the broken remnant, but the man who had once stood on a green shore half a world away and believed he could bear a cross across the ocean. It never lasted. The light would fade, the wind shift, and his gaze would cloud again. But Isabel held to those flickers the way sailors once held to stars glimpsed between storms, brief anchors in the endless dark. By then she knew the truth. The world would not remember him as he had been, and it would not care what it had taken to build its empire. It would remember only what suited its story, and so she stopped asking the world to remember. She remembered for it. Winter seeped into Santarem with a quiet that felt less like weather than like verdict. The Tagus ran slate under a sky the color of pewter, and the orange grove stood bare as bones against the cold. The house settled around them as if preparing to be sealed, each hinge and lintel remembering how to hold still. Years had narrowed to gestures, the way Isabel smoothed the linen on his pillow with the edge of her hand, the way Pedro measured the day by the track of light across a single square of floor. The world beyond their gates had grown vast and loud. Brazil's forests felled into timbers and sugar. The Indies nailed into a lattice of forts and treaties. But here the empire had contracted to breath and memory. He had become almost transparent. The weight that once gathered in his shoulders had dissolved, and the angles of him looked carved more by wind than by time. When he walked, it was a small voyage from one room to another, a navigation of shadows and the soft commotion of servants standing aside. Sometimes the old habits returned unbidden, the reflex glance at the sky for weather that could no longer touch him, the faint tightening of his jaw as if counting ships that were no longer under his command. The sea had retreated to a place behind his eyes, and only Isabel could see its tides. She understood that death is not a single event, but a shoreline a man approaches by degrees. The first encroachments were hardly visible, a winter cough that would not lift, a morning when he did not rise at dawn, a book left open so long that the dust on its pages drew its own script. She kept the house ordered against the chaos of endings. The linens changed, the coals banked, the chapel candles arranged in strict ranks, because order had been the one weapon granted to her in a world that mistook its whims for law. News still reached them, the world's insistence knocking like wind at the shutters. Lisbon called Brazil by that name, without remembering who had first placed a cross on its sand. The crown parceled the western shore into captaincies and charters. Sailors returned with stories of parrots, timber, river mouths broad as gulfs, of sugar mills creaking like the bones of beasts. In the Indies, Afonso de Albuquerque laid out fortresses like chess pieces and taught the world to fear Portugal's guns. The chronicles inked the names of men who had not been born when Pedro leaned into the trade wind and crossed the empty blue. He was there as one might notice a faded watermark at the edge of a page, present if the light struck right, easy to miss if it did not. At night she sat beside his bed while the house went silent around them. His breath rasped with the stubbornness of a sailor who had once outlasted storms. She read to him from Scripture, not for comfort. Comfort implies a bargain, but to lay a sound over the room that remembered him as more than a wound. Sometimes she read Camina's letter, the copy she had obtained through channels she never named, the one that spoke of a land generous and green, of people who smiled without guile, of a cross raised beside a sea that breathed in long, innocent rhythms. When she read, his face softened, and for a few moments she could see the man who had stood at Porto Seguro, with wonder clenched in both hands like a fragile box he dared not open too quickly. She had kept the world at bay long enough. There would be no second act for him, no return to the palace, no summons to command. Portugal had decided his place, and it was not at the prow. He had become, in the kingdom's ledger, a cost entered long ago, balanced by profits others enjoyed. Isabel absorbed the insult with the same composure that had once slipped her husband's name into a king's ear. Composure had been her armor and her art. Now it became her final act of love. She would not let the world see it win. The last winter broke into a thin spring, and with it came an afternoon bright enough to be mistaken for reprieve. He rose from his bed with a steadiness that surprised them all and asked, or rather, allowed himself to be guided, into the courtyard. The orange trees were in blossom, a white that almost hurt to look at, fragrance lifting on a breeze off the river. He stood under their low constellations of petals and closed his eyes. For a moment he looked as he had long ago, a man measuring a horizon no one else yet knew existed. He did not speak. He did not need to. In his stillness, she heard the only confession sailors ever make when they are done with the sea, that the world had been too large and too small at once, that he had given it his measure and been left with a remainder he could not spend. She rested her hand on his sleeve, and the silence between them became a kind of harbor. The light shifted, a cloud passed, and the reprieve ended. They returned inside with the slowness of a tide ebbing. He declined in small, rational steps afterward, as tidy and dying as he had been in command. On a morning that began with the bells of Euronymos rolling down the river like a benediction from a city that had not meant to give him any, Pedro Álvares Cabral died. The servants stood in the hall with their heads bowed. The priest murmured the words that finalize a body for the earth. Isabel had already arranged the burial in Santarém, in a church where stone kept the weather at a respectful distance. She allowed no crowd, no curious nobles with condolences sharpened into instruments of memory theft. The coffin was simple, the ceremony short. He was placed in the ground as he had always belonged to it, not as a myth, but as a man. Days later, the city learned, and there were memorials improvised as if to repair what neglect had forgotten to do. A few verses surfaced in broadsheets. A handful of courtiers spoke warmly of his service. The palace issued a note framed in phrases practiced for occasions like this. It was all correct and all insufficient. Isabel accepted it without granting it power. She had already buried the only version of him that mattered. In the hush that followed, she moved through the house like the echo of a bell. Grief for a woman like her is a structural force, not a spectacle. She set accounts in order, saw to the tenants, oversaw the distribution of alms in his name without ever mentioning charity. She made lists. She burned letters that would do him no good in a world eager to misunderstand. She spoke to their children in a voice even as mathematics, reminding them of the obligations that outlive fame. Then the fever took her. It announced itself as a stiffness in the bones, a heat in the blood that lace and prayer could not draw out. She did not conceal it. Concealment suggests shame. She lay in the bed where he had lain, the linen smelling faintly of cedar and orange blossom. The physician came with his instruments and his theories, but she had already measured her condition against a scale not found in his books. She had lived her entire life in ratios, risk to reward, cost to gain, love to loss, and the sum now presented itself with elegant inevitability. What she thought in those final days no one recorded, but a life spent wielding silence as precisely as a blade does not end in complaint. The servants discovered a packet in her hand after the last breath, sealed with her ring, instructions already set in motion, legacies arranged, the last reshaping of the future she could fashion from a past she had not chosen. She died within days of him, perhaps hours if one measures time the way grief does, and the city murmured at the closeness. Those who believed in romance called it fidelity. Those who believed in fate called it design. Isabel would have called it conclusion. They lay side by side in Santarem, beneath stone that does not trouble itself with equity. There were candles, and then there were none. There were names spoken, and then they were said less often. The empire churned on, its appetite not yet sated. Brazil's coast sprouted sugar mills and missions. Men with Portuguese names learned to forget where the first letter had been written and to whom it had been sent. The Indies kept boiling with trade and iron, ports changing hands, flags printing and unprinting themselves against wind. The chronicles continued to favor those who survived long enough to administer their own myths. Yet history, being porous and forgetful by design, left gaps where truth could breathe. Sailors still told of a green shore glimpsed under a sun like a revelation, of a cross raised where there had been only wind and sand. Old men in taverns spoke a name that sounded like the edge of a wave withdrawing, Cabral, and shrugged at the way the city had managed to misplace him. A clerk copying a list of commanders glanced up from his page, and for reasons he could not explain, wrote Isabel de Castro in the margin, and then scraped it off again with a knife. What endures, Isabel would have said, if anyone had asked, is not the monument, but the pressure that made it necessary. A continent speaks Portuguese. A fleet learned the grammar of crossing and returning. A crown habituated itself to distance and power. Somewhere under all that architecture of consequence lies a beach where a cross once stood and then did not, where men knelt in armor and others watched from the edge of the trees, unsure what they were seeing. That is the scene the world edits to its convenience. But the story that moves beneath it, the quiet of a woman's arrangement, the bargain of a marriage that lifted a man onto a platform from which the horizon grew, remains undocumented and therefore truer. If one were to stage an ending, and every life deserves one worthy of the labor that made it, you would not choose the palace or the key. You would open on the two graves in Santarem, the stone worn down to a texture that feels like remembered weather. The camera would climb into the cold light, catch the Tagus pouring east like a long, bright decision, drift across the city's roofs until the mouth of the river widens into Atlantic. For a moment the screen would fill with water and the sound of it breathing, that unpunctuated line that both gives and takes away. In the center of that field of moving light a cross would appear, not timber now, but the shape left behind when weight is lifted, an absence as legible as presence. History remembers the man who planted a cross on foreign soil, and the land he named remembers no names at all. Between those two instruments of forgetting stands a woman who taught a kingdom to hold its breath, and then, having taught it, withdrew. The paradox is not that empires rest on love, they seldom do, but that love, ordinary and stubborn, can shape an empire's first step and receive in return neither coin nor gratitude nor place in the procession. The cross endures in language. The woman endures in consequence. The frame recedes. The ocean keeps its counsel. Somewhere beyond the horizon, a coast breathes under trees bright as parrots, and the wind that once filled his sails travels onward without intention, touching ships that do not know the names of the dead. In Santarem, the stones hold their temperature. The light changes. The story closes, not with thunder, but with the hush of a tide turning, as if what has been taken and what has been given finally find a balance that human hands cannot measure.